The origin of the name Creek is uncertain. The tradition is that it was given by white people from the number of creeks and watercourses in the country. The Indian name is Muscogee. The creeks came from the west. They have a tradition among them that there is, in the fork of Red River, west of the Mississippi, 2 mounds of earth, that at this place the Cassettas, Conatas, and Chickasaws found themselves, that being distressed by wars with red people, they crossed the Mississippi, and directing their course eastwardly, they crossed the falls of Tallapoosa, above Tookabauchi, settled below the falls of Chattahoochee, and spread out from thence to Ocmulgee, Oconee, Savannah, and down the seacoast towards Charleston. Here they first saw white people, and from hence they have been compelled to retire back again to their present settlements. Benjamin Hawkins.
So when De Soto passed through, he left European diseases in his wake. We're not exactly sure what they were. It may have been something as simple as chickenpox, which these people had no historical association with, and could have had a detrimental effect on their population. But there appears to have been about a 50% population drop in the Native Americans, and this caused the 2 provinces to fuse and form one group. These people became known as the Historic Creeks. And this movement of Malville Indians from the Warrior Valley that we've documented archaeologically may be the archaeological evidence for the Casita migration legends. Now, the Creek Confederacy formed about 100 years later, when groups such as the Shawnee and the Appalachee and the Corsati and the Alabama all started moving into central Alabama to settle among the core group of the Creeks, because this core group gave these non-local groups protection in numbers, and they were protected from the slavers who were coming down from the north, who were getting guns from the Dutch and from the French and from the English, and attacking and capturing Creek groups in the south and taking them back north to either incorporate them into their own society or selling them as slaves, where they would go to the sugar plantations in Caribbean to be used as labor.
The Creek Allies were a very interesting group in that either consciously or unconsciously, they set out to increase their population. And they did this by just simply the fact they did live in a very rich area and by incorporating refugee Indian groups from surrounding areas, such as the Shawnee and the Natchez. And they grew their populations. Refugee groups were invited in to live in the valleys in places assigned to them. And their only requirements was that they defend the Creek heartland. They could keep their own languages, their own customs. Gradually, they all came to fall closer into the Muscogee or Creek customs.
We have a situation of changing society in the Creek country, a more diverse condition over time. Even 100 years earlier, the Creeks were already diverse in that the main core towns of the Creek Confederacy spoke two different languages, Muscogee and Hitchiti. Soon after that, the Creek Confederacy began accepting refugees to build their numbers. And these refugees came from various places. They spoke various languages, and they had a number of different ethnicities with different customs. There were Uchis and Shawnees coming from the north and east. There were Natchez coming from the west. There were Chickasaws among the Creeks in those days. So a growing ethnic mix, a growing linguistic mix, all sort of disorienting. And in addition to this, black Africans began appearing in the Creek country in larger numbers. And to top it off, in this particular time, growing numbers of Anglo-Americans.
Each of the tribal towns have a supreme autonomy to themselves. They're each a sovereign and supreme city or site or place, beholden to nobody. They hold the ultimate sovereignty. And so none of the tribal towns had any need or reason to be above the other or being a preeminent above another. They were all equal in that sense. And they organized loosely on this Confederacy that was label put on us because we had a similar culture and traditions that bound us and as a group, as a larger, loosely connected group, likened to what the archaeologists say is the Mississippian culture, so to speak, or the Southeastern cult complex, or any of those sort of terms. It was all based on that idea of the tribal town being preeminent and having all of these certain rituals. And these rituals were very, very similar among each of the towns, but slightly different in each town, which made them unique in each town and made each town unique. So it's that idea or that type of mechanism that the United States and France and Spain all had troubles with. They always wanted to meet with one person or one group, and they couldn't get that with the Muscogee Creek, the Confederacy.
By the 17th century, the Creek Indians of Georgia and Alabama had become the largest and most powerful Indian group in the southeastern United States. They dominated a vast area, numbering some 20,000, arranged in about over 50 towns. They were primarily farmers and hunters. They raised crops of corn, squash, and beans along the fertile river lands and hunted deer, turkey, other animals. They fished, and they gathered wild forest products. It was a very, very prosperous economy, enabling them to support their dense populations. They lived in small towns called tawas, numbering from several hundred up to one or two that were over 1,000 people. They lived in small wooden houses surrounding large ceremonial centers of huge council houses and plazas. Their society was matrilineal, meaning that they traced descent through the mother. You inherited your name, your clan affiliation, land, and other things through your mother's line. A man's closest male relative was not his biological father, but his mother's brother. The matrilineal groups were organized into clans, named frequently for different animals such as bear, beaver, wolf. The French attempted to directly settle in Creek country at Fort Toulouse and were very successful because of their policies of dealing with the Indians on their own terms, of learning Indian customs. But by 1763, the French were forced out beyond the Mississippi. The English dealt in this area originally out of the southern colonies, primarily through trade. The trade they were most interested in were deer skins. Europe was very short of fine leathers, and so hundreds of thousands of deer skins were shipped out of Savannah, Charleston, Pensacola, and other areas. In exchange, the Indians got guns, cloth, other items of manufacture nature. After the American Revolutionary War, the Americans became the principal players. They continued the deerskin trade, but they were more anxious to acquire land. By this time, the Georgia colonies, the South Carolina colonies had grown, and populations were expanding, and the frontier was piling up against Creek country due to the agricultural practices of the southern colonies of using up vast amounts of land, abandoning and moving on and just leaving a devastated landscape behind them. There was tremendous pressure on the Creek Indians.
The Tensaw community really began in 1783 when Alexander McGouirk migrated to the area with some cattle, enslaved laborers, and his sister, Sophia Durant. And so when they came to this Tensaw region, they were establishing a cowpen plantation, and they were also there to trade with the Spanish. So they're really kind of already involved in a lot of these different economic pursuits that we would consider really Euro-American. So they're ranching, they're planting maybe different types of products, tobacco, maybe even the early stages of cotton. And they're trading a lot of their goods with the Spanish, and they're offering to really provide the meat for those Spanish garrisons. And so when he's going down there, he's going there after the Revolution to try to set up that alliance with the Spanish, because the British are now gone, and he needs to make sure that he keeps the trade open. And when he starts negotiating with the Spanish, he convinces them to allow a British trading firm, Panton Leslie and Company, to open up stores in St. Augustine and eventually Pensacola. And so they're kind of coming in and able to supply, and he makes sure that he is the center of that supply chain into the Creek Nation. So what is the civilization policy? Well, at the end of the American Revolution, you have this problem where more and more settlers, they keep wanting to go west, and the federal government is saying, you can't keep going. We cannot afford to be fighting all of these different Native American nations. Secretary of War Henry Knox said we don't have the military power, we don't have the financial power to do it, so we have to come up with an alternative. So in his talks with President Washington, they're trying to figure out a new method. How do we handle negotiating with Native Americans? It can't be at that state level anymore. It can't be Georgia negotiating with Creek or so on and so forth. We have to make it a federal policy. And so what they want to do is to bring the Creek Nation to the federal government, and they want to make it so that they can align Creek interests with the United States without having to go to war. So they've proposed something called the civilization policy. They want to shift all of that from what they consider a state of savagery to a state of civilized society. And they're going to do that by sending in an agent, so an agent of the federal government to live with the Creeks and to teach them. So the very first of these agents from the United States is a man named Benjamin Hawkins.
Benjamin Hawkins, a remarkable character. He was sent down to deal with both the Creeks and the Cherokees, given simply the instructions to further U.S. interests in this area. This is following the very important Treaty of New York, Treaty of New York, 1790. He was sent down to simply just oversee who were the Creeks and how can we deal with them. His basic approach was one of acculturation, of teaching the Indians to become more like Americans. So he attempted to teach agriculture using horse and plow, but he tried to teach it to the men, and the men were not the agriculturists. The women were the farmers among the Creeks. They did all of the farming. Men hunted, did warfare, conducted politics, and so forth. Benjamin Hawkins was very successful because he did learn the Muscogee language. He met with them in council, he met with them at ceremonies, at ball games, and other things. But he was never able to achieve his idea of making them into sort of like red Americans.
Having consulted the general on the objects of my mission, and obtained the requisite information and on some points relative thereto, I wrote to the Secretary of War. Hopewell on Kiowa, November 22nd, 1796. Sir, I have been unwell since I left you, and unable to travel as fast as I intended when I set out from Philadelphia. I arrived, however, here, the seat of General Pickens, on the 19th inst. I have explained to the General the benevolent views of the government in relation to the Indians, with which he is much pleased. Situated as he is on the frontier, confided in and respected by the citizens and Indians, he can and will do much in aid of our plan. I have the honor to be, with sincere regard and esteem, sir, your obedient servant, Benjamin Hawkins. Since I left the mountains yesterday, I find I am on the creek waters. This river is the Tallapoosa. Benjamin Hawkins.
the European powers had dealt with trade through either resident traders living in the Creek villages, or later through the United States establishment of trade factories, which were agents set up in various key points with trade goods, to which the Indians could come and trade deer skins, cowhides, and other forest products for such things as guns, cloth, metal, and so forth. The factory system was very advantageous to the Americans in that it did place the Creeks in considerable debt, to the point that it was almost unpayable. The Creeks owned thousands of deer hides. The idea was developed by the United States of trading land in payment for the debts. To the Creeks, in certain areas, this was no problem because they sat on millions of acres, and so they would be perfectly willing to trade off 100,000 acres here, 200,000 acres there. But eventually, even they could see the inevitable end, the steady loss of Creek territory. And so they started saying, no, we will not give up any more land. There were certain powerful Creek leaders who advocated that no further Creek land should be given up. The United States continued to press pressure on the Creeks to the point of withholding trade items. This placed the Creeks in a very serious position because they could not manufacture many of these items that they needed so desperately for their economy. So the animosity grew. Certain groups who were able to pay off the trade were more disposed towards the United States, where other groups who were more deeply in debt developed a very strong sense of animosity, of resistance.
The thing that interests me most about the Creek War is that it was a civil war, and it was a war that took the form of a religious revitalization movement. And so this was a war that had aspects of religious visions and prophets and a religious interpretation of natural events that were some of the main drivers of what happened. And we can trace some of this back to the year 1811, a couple of years before the war started, when a number of Shawnee prophets were visiting the South, and they visited the Creeks at that time. Those Shawnee prophets came with Tecumseh, and what Tecumseh was doing, he was a great war leader among the Northern Indians, was trying to persuade the Southern Indians to join him in a pan-Indian movement to push out the whites. He wasn't very successful in the South, but he found a listening audience at the town of Tukabatchee in the Creek country. And it's the presence of those Shawnee prophets there at that time in 1811 that had a large influence on the Creeks.
Och jag bag rundan. Taman jäzar och fulla jäzaks. Shari nini in hayat. Istijari hunida batsa. Abogar. Nini shari. Ubanaget hayaget. Undun. Tastinogalgi hokkola. Tubala abogar. Istoboskade. Humakahani rundan. Amin lägera och full kahan noes. Kisalge. Chin lägga kahanet. Umates. Wajinagi, infli, shimandatskaget, naskaba widlakates. Wajinagi, shijokaro, higana hawakle, nuk milgates. Sasakpa, mayatijit, shinipkijit, omayov, sura halwe, totka awilipket, hijaktases. Tipikanu man alhet, chali takpatejayo, higana nigiyates.
The prophet movement that appeared among the Creeks in the around 1811-12 when Tecumseh visited from the north, he was bringing the thoughts of his brother Tenskwatawa, the Shawnee prophet. To the south, the Creeks were already familiar with these ideas, and many of them had already adopted them. So Tecumseh's arrival in the Creek Nation was kind of more to encourage more people to adopt these ideas that were already here. And he was very successful with this. And in fact, one of the weapons that he suggested they use was the war club, which was called a red stick. And that's where the Red Stick Warriors got their name, is from this weapon of choice used by many Indians throughout the eastern U.S. at that time.
To symbolically and figuratively raise the red stick of war was a very powerful statement. And in the early part of the 19th century, a part of the Creek Nation did raise the red stick of war against their own people. The red stick itself has been posited, what was it? Maybe it was introduced by northern Indians. Maybe a red stick is simply a way of keeping time until, the number of days before you go to battle. But a red stick was a weapon, a very powerful, symbolic, and real weapon that was employed. And the main reason that a part of the Creek people went to war against their own National Council was because of disagreements over how the National Council had handled demands by Americans. Following a series of murders, including a home invasion in the Duck River in Tennessee, of murders and robberies on the Federal Road, Americans were determined to make Creeks pay. And through the agent, Benjamin Hawkins, the Creek National Council was told that if they did not turn these individuals over to the United States for punishment, then that would be seen as an act of war. In fact, those murders and robberies were viewed by Americans not as acts of individual Creeks, but as an act of war by the entire nation against America. And to use Andrew Jackson's famous phrase, if peace was not made, if things were not handled, then the Tennesseans, the Americans, would come down and handle this situation for the Creek Nation. And so the leadership of the Creek people called the National Council, and thus we call the people who adhere to their way of thinking about things, National Creeks, decided they really had no choice, that they had to apprehend and they had to punish these people who had committed crimes against Americans.
So that Civil War began in the spring of 1813 and involved many battles. There was a siege of the central complex of public buildings at Tuckabashie, where the Miko and his followers were actually fortified themselves behind some kind of a wall and were besieged by Red Sticks for some time until they made an escape eastward to Benjamin Hawkins' agency. By the summer of 1813, the Americans were not participating in this. They were standing on the outside looking in at this Civil War going on and kind of anticipating that they would be drawn in at some point. But the actual battle that engaged American militia troops with the Red Sticks occurred almost by accident in July of that year. And it involved a group of Red Stick warriors who had taken a pack train south to Pensacola, which was in Spanish hands at the time, and they were desperate for ammunition to carry on this Civil War that had been going on throughout the summer. So they loaded up with pack horses full of gunpowder and lead shot and headed back north on what's called the Wolf Trail in southern Alabama today. And as they were crossing this little stream crossing called Burnt Corn Creek, they were attacked by an American militia group that had come out of the Tensaw region. This was a group of local white settlers primarily, and on the way to Burnt Corn Creek, they had enlisted the help of some Tensaw Creeks. So this is both Creek Indians on both sides of this battle. When they reached this crossing, the Red Stick Creeks were ambushed basically by the American and Creek militias, and initially they retreated, leaving their pack horses behind. And as the Americans and Creeks came down to kind of pillage the pack horse train, the Red Stick warriors regrouped and counterattacked. And the American militia then ran away. They were not the heroes of this story at all. And in fact, the leader of the American militia was lost in the woods for about a week until some of the Tensaw Creeks found him and rescued him. They eventually decided that they would attack the people they thought were most responsible for their ambush at Burnt Corn Creek. And these were the people who'd taken refuge inside Fort Mims. It's a little stockade that encompassed about an acre, about a mile south of the creek boundary at the time, in the Tensaw. And not only were there American settlers taking refuge in Fort Mims, but also many of the Tensaw Creeks who had fought at Burnt Corn were also inside Fort Mims. And so the Red Stick Creeks chose this target very carefully. There were about 20 settler forts in this region of the Forks in the Tombigbee, Tensaw area. And they specifically chose Fort Mims because of the presence of these Tensaw Creeks there. And so when the attack began, it was very successful. This occurred right about noon, which is an unusual time for a battle to start in any Indian war in the East during the 18th and 19th centuries. Almost all battles took place very early in the morning, so you have the surprise effect of attacking at dawn or before dawn. But here it's broad daylight. The gate of the fort was wide open because people had been coming and going for weeks. They'd been forted up for about a month at Fort Mims. Because there were so many people there, some close to 500 people taking refuge in this 1 acre size fort. They had to go get food routinely, and so people came and went, and the gate was open. So the Red Sticks essentially ran right into the fort, and before the alarm was given.
It's an interesting little war. It's a war that comes from very, very, very different directions, geographically, culturally, and even generationally. The people that are concerned on the Creek side, the generation differences of those that went, say, to New York that knew how large the United States was, what their resources were. But they were trapped into a situation that made the factors of the war and which way it came from and how it was fought, from the Carolinas to Tennessee to Mississippi to Louisiana. At all these troops, all these people are concerned about what's happening with the Creek Nation, and the Muscogee speakers all throughout. We see that with troops after Fort Mims. Fort Mims, in many ways, was a mistake. It's a Creek response to getting into their internal politics at Burnt Corn Creek, of intercepting where they were getting supplies from Florida, which is very important that they're getting their supplies from Florida. They felt it was getting into their business and further threatening. Of course, the biggest mistake they made was the series of attacks that include the attack at Fort Mims. That set the United States and all of its allied parties here in the Southeast totally against the Creek Nation. The massacre at Mims, which has its roots in peoples and I'll call it feuds that come from this Tallapoosa Valley here. It could have been a great attack. It could have gotten their point across, but it turned into a slaughter. The additional attacks in the Clark County area of present-day Alabama, called the Forks, that was further and further and further. They solidified their enemies' impressions of them. No matter what Hawkins says, no matter how many warnings Hawkins gives, his credibility is totally shot by this time with the people of the United States faction.
Brave Tennesseans, your frontier is threatened with invasion of the savage foe. Already do they advance towards your frontier with their scalping knives unsheathed to butcher your wives, your children, and your helpless babes. Time is not to be lost. We must hasten to the frontier, or we will find it drenched in the blood of our fellow citizens. Andrew Jackson.
So they got into the field very quickly, got into the northern part of present-day Alabama. You have Little Fusky, you have Tulisahatchee, you have Talladega, all of which were definite losses to the Creek Party. And every loss, every gun that's lost, every man that's lost is another stab in the wounds of the Creek Nation. There was no way that they could ever believe they could win this once this war started. And I think those people, again, that went to New York in the 1790s saw all the force that could be brought to them by the United States, all the people that were there, and you'll see that in their leadership. The older ones are very much more with Hawkins and his people. The Georgians weren't very good in many ways. They weren't very successful. They get at least a draw. Maybe I'd call it really a victory at Atassi, coming across the Federal Road, driving the Creeks further back up into the valleys. The Battle of Calebi Creek, also known as Camp Defiance. Luckily, the friendly Indians, Tippy Bernard and his friendly Indians, saved the Georgians bacon. In fact, literally, they saved their supplies, which were bacon. But again, it was the assault, and that the warring party recognized that they could not stay this close to the Federal Road, that this was the best supply line that the American faction had, was the Federal Road. And so they moved further to the north as they're heading towards what becomes Horseshoe Bend.
So Horseshoe Bend sort of stands as a touchstone for the horrendous destruction of the Creek War. Americans at the time derided Creeks in their way of making war. They derided them and their so-called prophets. But Horseshoe Bend allows us, in a very real way, to understand what the Creeks themselves were up to. Yes, they did call on their traditional spiritual powers for protection in battle, in the same way that the Christians they fought called on the biblical God to help them. But the Creeks were also very specific in building an incredible fortification that they assumed would protect them from an invading army. Where they miscalculated, and miscalculated badly, was the realization, or the failure to realize, that Americans would be able to send so many men in. And by the time March rolled around of 1814, when the battle took place, late March, the Americans outnumbered the Creeks 3-1. And that army was diverse. It included a large number of Cherokees. It included a contingent of Creeks. And the coalition army was able to completely surround Horseshoe Bend and wage a very successful attack on the Creeks.
And so when they returned in March, they knew where they were headed, but when they reached there, they realized that they had actually encountered a much more substantial defensive work than they expected to find. And this was this big barricade at the Horseshoe, big log breastwork that stretched across the peninsula, protecting the town of Topeka back in the bend of the river. And so when they were faced with this, they had a pretty inadequate cannon that they used fairly ineffectively to fire on this barricade. And they tried round shot apparently, and it just bounced off the walls. So they then switched to grape shot, which did have some effect. Grape shot's little lead balls that penetrated through the gaps in the barricade. So they were making some progress, but they weren't going to defeat the barricade by artillery. So eventually the U.S. infantry troops that were the most experienced troops in Jackson's army made a frontal assault on the barricade and took it by storm. And so it was a really dramatic moment in the war. And even then, there was quite a desperate fight at the barricade. But as that was going on, General Coffey's Tennessee militia troops and Cherokees were circling around the peninsula, and the Cherokees actually swam across, got some dugout canoes that the Creeks had tied up at the bend, the river, and they ferried the Cherokee and American troops, militia troops, across the river and attacked the village from behind. And it was that combined attacks from north and south that eventually overwhelmed the Red Stick defenses at the Horseshoe.
But there were several towns that chose to stand in the way, to be the last bastion of defense, so to speak. One of the elders had told me at one time that the word Muscogee had a connotation of the people that gathered together, and in that gathering together they make their stand. The Ispogogi the West, not the last, like some Westerners would posit this as a definition of being the last, but no, it was the people that took that stand as being the last stand. So the Creek Wars flowed along that line where they would resist as the troops marched further and further south. And they decided they would gather up to make that last stand. And they did that at the Horseshoe Bend, of course, from that history side of it.
Following the massacre victory at Horseshoe Bend, many things then happened. It's a whole new phase of what's going on. Andrew Jackson brings his troops from the Horseshoe Bend down to the Tallapoosa Basin. He goes to Fusahachie, Hilawali, other villages along the northern edge of the Tallapoosa River, burning those villages and finding any refugees that he could find, both white and Indian. At the same time, troops out of Georgia are bringing in supplies and supposedly sealing the border on the south bank of the Tallapoosa River so that no refugees can get in to go to Florida. They all come to Fort Jackson. Fort Jackson is being built at that time by North and South Carolina troops. The Tennessee troops do not stay here long. Their time in service is beginning to end, and Andrew Jackson is gone within a week. But a very important thing happens during that week in that William Weatherford, those recognized as one of the great leaders of the insurgents, the Creek insurgents, comes in, brings a deer, and surrenders himself to Andrew Jackson. There are many varied stories of troops wanting to kill him immediately or not being able to recognize him, but many, many stories. But he came as an honorable man and surrendered himself. One of the big questions that it's quickly done is to why wasn't he immediately put under arms? Why wasn't he hung? Why wasn't he killed? There's a lot of personal opinions. My personal opinion is that Andrew Jackson recognized him as him being William Weatherford as a man of the time, an honorable man, a man who said what he did and went forward. To paraphrase what Weatherford said at the time is, I fought you the best I could. I don't have any more warriors. My women and children are starving. I quit. How can we do this? And Jackson let him leave. Well, he left. He went to some lands just to the south of us at Fort Jackson, and stayed out there on an island for a while. During that same time period, Andrew Jackson, who's nothing but a Tennessee general at this point, goes back to Tennessee. William Weatherford's on the island, a North Carolina colonel who is stationed at Fort Jackson at this point, recognized that the only way that he's going to be able to bring in the refugees he needs to along the Alabama River, it's very important to bring these refugees in, is to put William Weatherford in charge of the friendly Indians and to go with a battalion of North Carolina troops that scour the Alabama River and bring in hundreds of refugees. There were a refugee camp at Fort Jackson. There was one at Fort Decatur, one at Fort Mitchell, all along the Federal Road. Even Andrew Jackson recognized the problem that they needed to feed the Creeks or fight them again. So you've got an end to the warfare, and then Andrew Jackson returns. Andrew Jackson returns as a major general of the United States Army. By deaths and resignations and other things, he suddenly rises from a militiaman to Major General of the United States Army, and they begin to start putting together the demands for the Treaty of Fort Jackson. He had his ideas. Hawkins had his ideas. And there were others that had their different ideas. This ends with, in a way, kind of ends Benjamin Hawkins in this area. Hawkins is kicked off of the treaty committee. And once that happens, he's losing all his power. He's losing his power to talk about boundaries, etc. So this becomes Andrew Jackson's thing.
Ishtachago, Pomadotka, Manlegedos. Idin fatsida ahobana sigot os. Hifunnin ebon legedidondos. Atsage, ahoska, Pomahayat. Igana hamga ingishida sawahit os. Ebon leget, Pomanejet, Idalwa healin hakton. Ishte, idin hishida hitlidos. Colrain, fullet, idigitlit omadit, undon, pomanitos, momas, pujulitos, imbuidage, yamanigana, hitskagade, ovadid os, taman legide yadzat, legi begas. Sum give off, imbuidage, legide ojagibares.
The war supposedly ended with the Treaty of Fort Jackson, by which the United States acquired over 21 million acres of land from the Creek people. It was a treaty forced down the throats of the National Council. They really had no choice at that point. And while the war ended there, I think it's important to realize that that war really continues in a different form. It continues as the First Seminole War. There were pockets of resistance. Entire villages along the Tallapoosa River shifted to Florida as a result of this invasion of the Creek Nation and become the kernel of the Seminole Nation. Osceola, so famous as the leader of the Florida Seminoles, was actually born in what is now Macon County, Alabama. But at the time, he was born in a Creek town, and he and his family were refugees. But while the Creek people lost so much land, they retained land as well, and they retained their sovereignty as a nation. And I think of the aftermath of this horrific conflict in which nearly every town on the Tallapoosa, Coosa, and Alabama rivers was left in ashes, in which the planting for the entire year of 1814 was disrupted, in which starvation was rampant, in which animals had been killed, so horses, cattle, all these were gone. The entire wealth of a people was destroyed by this war, and they were left with nothing but their own hands and heavy hearts to rebuild. And yet they did, with very little help from the Americans. Very little help except some food right at the end of the war, some emergency rations that Jackson's army provided. They had to rebuild their towns. Some people had to relocate if their lands had been out in the area ceded by the treaty. And the Creek people rebuilt their nation into a very strong and sort of a nation that had been tested by this terrible war. And they had to come and they then had to come face to face with the specter of Indian removal in the 1830s, by which there was increasing pressure on them to sell their lands and move west and to leave. And over, the Creek people continued to make various decisions based on what they considered was their personal interest. Some Creeks did leave the Creek Nation proper in the east and move west. Others were determined to stay at no matter the cost. And the treaty that the Creek people ultimately signed with the national government destroyed their nation. It destroyed their sovereignty. It disarticulated their government apparatus. But it left the possibility that individual Creeks could own land and stay in what would become the state of Alabama. The federal government in the state of Alabama did not honor treaty provisions and protect people who wanted to do that. So the Creek people lose their land, and the Creek national government is relocated into Indian territory. But between that, the late 1830s and the end of the war in 1814 is a tremendous period of renewal and revival by the survivors of a horrific war who rebuilt their nation and tried to rebuild their lives in a very changed world.
Some of the concepts that are portrayed on us as Creek people, and some of the ideas that are laid on us, either inadvertently or maybe, we don't know, advertently, that there's an underlying theme behind all that, or need to say it that way. And it's this idea that we're always referenced in any kind of work as a past people, like we are no longer here today. But I just want to point out that that is so far from the truth that we see all of the things that we have read about from historical accounts from the past, and from our oral legends, and even from our actions today at the ceremonial grounds today, that none of this has left us since time immemorial. We still make those same connections, we still do the same rituals, we still have the same thoughts as we would have a couple hundred years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago. Those ideas and those mechanisms that are in place that make our ethos are still in place today as they have always been. And it does us a disservice when people tend to put us in the non-existent past, like we don't exist anymore. And I'm not sure again why that pattern keeps arising, but it seems to be something that we as Creek people have to always fight against, and it needs to end.
Quiet men and women keening, that almost broke our hearts and minds to leave the fields of tears, to leave the fields of tears. They came in floods and covered wagons, drove across our ancient lands, said to scorn our elders' wisdom, take the path that the Lord commands. They stole our hills, they stole our rivers, the Mother Earth with whom we're joined. they led us from our spirit fathers. It almost broke our hearts and minds to walk the trail of tears, to walk the trail of tears. It came at night.
Our name did sound. Jackson was a brutal man, in his heart he did lie. He tricked the prophet Francis and hung him there to die. And hung him there to die. Millie Francis' time was burnt, her people saw its doom. They had to leave their beloved home and seek the prairie's bloom. Millie Francis, daughter of the prophet's town. Millie Francis, that's how her name did sound. From Wakulla's waters, their steps were filled with fear. Although she saved a soldier's life, her reward a trail of tears. A trail of tears. The Muscogee Creek moved westward as the forest stood and cried. Along the trail of broken